Okay, my name is Carol Weinshell, and I am the Vice President of Program and Membership at Congregation Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport, Connecticut. We do Zoom programs. We've been doing them all throughout the pandemic, and I'd say we've been very successful. We've had a good time doing it. Tonight is the second part, I should say, of Jews Rock and Roll with our very own out-of-state member, Paul Friend, who grew up at Rodeph Sholom, and our current Rabbi Richard Eisenberg, who also grew up at Rodeph Sholom. They are going to run this program. What I'm going to say to you, just so that we don't have any distractions, that's the reason that you're muted, because we get noise in the background if your phone rings or your doorbell rings or any of those things. However, when it's time for questions, feel free to raise your hand, to jump in, and then remute, just to keep the decorum going. So without further ado, I don't know who's starting. Rabbi?
Yeah, I'm just, I would like just to start by thanking you, Carol, for opening it up and welcoming everyone. There are a number of people from Maryland that Glenn Germain brought in. Thanks, Glenn. And a number of people that Paul brought in, some friends of Paul's. We're just so glad that you all could be with us. And I want to issue a special thank you to Paul Friend, for your time, for your expertise. In a couple of moments, I'm going to turn it right over to Paul, but I just want to set the tone for tonight. And I guess here's where I'm, putting on my rabbi hat, Okay. And that is that obviously it goes without saying that we are living in very, very heavy, serious, and distressing times. Distressing and worrisome, especially with regard to what is going on in Europe. And it would be very easy for us to simply say, I am going to keep my eyes glued 24/7 to CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or whatever I watch, and fixate almost nonstop on what's going on across the world. But it's important to take time out, even when things that are going on are upsetting and disturbing. It's important to take a breather and have a little time for recreation and even a little time for fun. Because in taking that time, which we're going to do tonight, it's going to be hopefully fun and interesting, and we're going to get some good tidbits of information from Paul, things you never knew before, probably, things that may be categorized in the area of trivia that you may never, ever be called upon to use again. And maybe, it may go like in your head and then out of your head, but it's still in the moment, it's enjoyable, it's fun. And the problems of the world are going to be there no matter what. But we can be there, we can be more present and more engaged, I think, in the sorrows and suffering of our fellow human beings when we are energized, when we have more energy ourselves. And in order to energize ourselves, we need to take breathers and we need to take breaks and we need to allow ourselves to have some fun. So Paul, I just put a lot of pressure on you, my brother, a lot of pressure to make it fun. But whatever you do and however you do it, we are eternally grateful. So now I'm turning it over to my partner in crime for Jews and Rock and Roll, Part 2.
Part 2, the next day. Thank you. My name is Paul Friend. I'm used to dealing with pressure. When I was born, I was 6 feet tall, and now I'm 5'4". I've been ground down over the years. 2 disclaimers. The first one is that I have about 300 words to tell you a 30,000 word story. So we can't mention everything, and I'm not going to mention everything. I know in teaching, there's always you didn't mention this, and well, what about that? But that is the nature of time, you might say, and time constraints. And the second thing that I must tell you is that the mispronunciations are on me. And when I get into the meat of this, you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. What have we learned so far from last week? Well, I'll rattle off a couple of things in almost bullet form. First off, rock Jews, as we learned last week, are great storytellers and great entertainers. That's a fact. They can be funny and satirical. Often they are, but sometimes quite emotional. Rock Jews, as we learned last week, 2 weeks ago, excuse me, they're outsiders who eventually often get into the mainstream, into the inside. Perhaps most importantly, something that it really hit me 2 weeks ago, rock Jews do not necessarily wear their heritage on their sleeve. In fact, they tend to mask it, and in some cases, as you'll learn, literally. But if you dig deep enough, I think you can see that rock Jews are influenced in some ways by their heritage. So, Rabbi, I'll tell you the first of my big 3 examples. And I'll tell you the story of Gary Lee Weinrib. None of you have probably ever heard of Gary Lee Weinrib, but I suspect that many of you may have heard Gary Lee Weinrib. Well, who was he? He was born in, and the dates are important, by the way. He was born on July 29th, 1953 to, and I'm reading here so I don't get the names wrong, Moshe Weyer Weinrib and Malka Rubinstein. Interesting. Moshe and Malka were Jewish Holocaust survivors from Poland. They survived the ghetto where they met, and they were in their teens, in their late teens, amazingly, when they were both sent to Auschwitz. Malka was then transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Moshe was sent to Dachau. When the war ended 4 years later in 1945, and the Allies liberated the camps, Moshe set out, on a remarkable journey to find Malka. And amazingly, because this did not happen a lot, ladies and gentlemen, amazingly, he found his girlfriend alive and actually not in bad shape, all things considered, at Bergen-Belsen. He found her. That was not the usual thing when people tried to find each other after the war. He found his girlfriend. They married and they eventually emigrated to North America. And they had some kids. One of them was Gary. Well, as you might imagine, Malka's accent was extremely strong, and her Polish pronunciation of Gary actually sounded to a lot of people like Gary, Eddie. And this was picked up by his friends in school. And you know how nicknames develop. Eventually, because Gary was called Gary by his family and his friends, he eventually adopted Getty as his nickname, and eventually his stage name, and eventually actually his legal name. So Gary, because of his mother, who came from the old country, eventually renamed himself Getty. That's spelled Geddy, even though, of course, he was Gary. Well, after Gary, I'll call him that for the remainder of this story. After Gary's band became a very, very widely recognized rock group in the 70s and 80s, Successful despite Gary's extremely unusual high-pitched voice, he told the story about his family's life to the group's drummer, who was also the group's lyricist. And the drummer was so moved by Gary's story that the drummer wrote a song called Red Sector A that was based on Gary's story. And the song was released on an album by Gary's band called Grace Under Pressure. That was not a coincidental name. And the lyrics of Red Sector A are very moving, including this verse I'll read. I hear the sound of gunfire at the prison gates. Are the liberators here? Do I hope or do I fear? For my father and my brother, it might be too late, but I must help my mother stand up straight. When I first heard that song, I thought, why is Rush, a Canadian band of 3 people, why is Rush singing about Holocaust themes? Because it was pretty obvious to me. Why are they singing about Holocaust themes? They're not Jewish guys. That to me is a pretty good example of some themes that I think we've ascertained about Jews and rock. Who knew? Well, Gary Lee Weinrib knew. So that's just my first example. So Rabbi, I'll trade it over to you. I've got at least 2 more and perhaps even more interesting stories in the same vein. But that is the story of Geddy Lee and Rush.
From Rush.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to say a few things now, and then we'll go back to Paul, or maybe I'll say a few things now, and then we can pause if anybody has a comment or a question. We're keeping this pretty loose. So as Paul really aptly summarized it, from last time, American Jewish community mostly descended from the immigrants who came from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We were really in the very center of cultural trends. We were the trendsetters. We were ahead of the game in many cases, but we were, while paradoxically, we were really the trendsetters like Irving Berlin and the Gershwins and others. We were perpetually the outsiders. We were out on the margins. We were marginal. And I also talked about some of the background of Jews behind the scenes in rock and roll as record producers and record label owners and financiers, coming out of the long tradition of the inability of Jews from medieval times to own land. So Jews had to engage in commerce and finance by force because they could not farm land that belonged to them. Do you see what I'm saying? Now I want to take it in a slightly different direction. We also talked a little bit about the cataclysmic effects of the Holocaust. I'm really glad, Paul, that you brought up Geddy of Rush, because the Shoah, of course, such a cataclysmic event, could not help but influence people and affect people in the Jewish, young Jews. But then we had something else going on. And even though today we're talking primarily about the 70s and 80s, I just want to start, and I'll say a little bit about the 70s and 80s after. I just want to start by talking a little more about something that we didn't talk about much last time. And this is a transitional, the way I see it, a transitional phase in Jews and popular music and rock, folk rock, whatever you want to call it. And that is the tradition of protest music. So I want to briefly mention, when you think about, for instance, the counterculture of the 50s and early the beatnik culture, right? You think about one of the most famous Jewish subversive comedians of the time, and that was, of course, Lenny Bruce. I'm not talking about Rodney Dangerfield and Myron Cohen and people like that, as great as they were. I'm talking about the Lenny Bruces, the people who were really on the cutting edge. They were social critics. They got in trouble for it. They got thrown in jail for it. And then you had the Jewish presence in protest music that generated from the civil rights movement. Also, last time we talked about the connection between rock and roll and jazz, African-American culture and Jewish culture, right? And now we have the civil rights movement, and we all know that Jews, many Jews were at the very forefront of the fight for civil rights in the mid to late 50s and into the mid 60s. So think of some of the most well-known and famous Jews who wrote protest songs. Bob Dylan, of course. The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll is a good example of a song that was generated from civil rights. Masters of War as another example, okay? And if not for Peter, Paul, and Mary, Dylan may never have gotten the kind of fame that he got in the early 60s, because it was really Peter, Paul, and Mary who made Blowin' in the Wind famous. And they also covered a number of other Bob Dylan songs. And of course, 1/3 of Peter, Paul, and Mary was Jewish. That was Peter Yarrow. So far we've got Dylan, we've got Peter, Paul, and Mary, and we have Tom Lehrer as another example of a great folk singer who wrote brilliant, satirical, biting satirical music. My personal favorite probably was Phil Oakes. Phil Oakes was born Jewish. He wasn't strongly identified as a Jew, but he was Jewish. His life took tragic turns as he eventually succumbed to alcoholism and completed suicide, tragically and sadly, but was a brilliant singer, had an incredible voice, a wonderful songwriter, and much of his earlier music was based on anti-war and pro-civil rights kinds of music. Simon and Garfunkel, both of whom were Jewish, as you know, right? Started off as Tom and Jerry. I think we talked about them a little bit last time. Yeah. And had this song called Sounds of Silence that was acoustic only on their first album, but Columbia Records decided to electrify it. And I think Paul made reference to this last time. And electrifying that song, Sounds of Silence, on their second album made them wildly popular. But their first album had some protest kinds of stuff on it. He Was My Brother and songs like that. Sparrow, which was an allegory. In their second album, there was some social commentary and critique, but the third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, included some social criticism and protest songs. And already Simon and Garfunkel served as kind of like a bridge between folk music and rock. Let's not forget Mama Cass. I think probably Paul mentioned her too, yes, of the Mamas and the Papas. And one other group that I want to mention before I turn it back to Paul, is Jefferson Airplane. California psychedelic rock group of the 60s. They started out in the mid 60s. They became wildly popular when they brought the singer Grace Slick into the band and produced an album called Surrealistic Pillow, with featuring the song Somebody to Love, right? And some other great, it's actually, it happens to be a wonderful album, and it's very, very tuneful. The music is excellent. The harmonies are very complex. Jefferson Airplane had very complex harmonies, but interestingly, 3 of the group members were Jewish. Now, they didn't identify as Jewish. They didn't go to Hillel or synagogue, or they didn't worship on the high holidays, unless maybe they worshiped in the temple of Timothy Leary. That's possible. But as the 60s began to head towards a close, the Jefferson Airplane became increasingly political, and even kind of revolutionary. I mean, revolutionary in the sense of they believed in social revolution. They were fervently anti-Vietnam War protesters in their music, and their last album was called Volunteers, where they were essentially advocating social revolution as an anti-war protest movement. So they were very, it's interesting because, many of the most, and I'm not an expert on that kind of acid rock, psychedelic rock phase, but I know a little bit about it. And a lot of it was kind of like inward, internal imagery, kind of very weird, surrealistic, strange stuff. It was less common for psychedelic groups to engage in social criticism and protest. It just didn't happen much. I mean, you think of the psychedelic stars of the time: Jimi Hendrix, Cream, I don't know. Paul can come up with some other ones, I'm sure. I'm glad, Quicksilver Messenger Service. I mean, you can come up with a bunch of the Grateful Dead, but most of them weren't so much into social protest and criticism. It's interesting that Jefferson Airplane, a group that had 3 Jewish members, was real, whether or not you agree with what they were advocating, okay, they were very much inspired by social criticism and protest movement. So I find that kind of interesting, and it's kind of a bridge that takes us from the late 60s into the more heavy metal era of the 70s and 80s, which included some very prominent Jewish musicians. And Paul may be talking about that in the next segment.
Yes.
Or not. He probably will, if I know you. But you want to pause for a minute and see if anybody has a comment or question? Let's take a quick pause.
Yeah, Rabbi, I'd like to mention some things.
But can you say who you are, please?
Ben Sholom.
Oh, hey, Ben.
How are you? Jefferson Airplane, because
Ben, you're making me dizzy.
I'm
You're
sorry,
triggering.
I have it all
You're
set
triggering.
now.
You're triggering my vertigo.
I won't flash any lights.
Okay.
In volunteers, I mean, it was, I wasn't really over it at that point. I was still, fairly into marching. And like Phil Oakes said, we're not marching anymore, right? I'm not marching anymore. Which I took with a friend of mine to the album to KDNA in St. Louis. I don't know, shortly after it came out, I guess, because I heard that the song has never been played on the radio. Right? Call it peace or call it reason, call it love or call it treason, right? And so they were very happy to play it on the radio. That they said, it might be the first time ever, we don't know. But volunteers hits a number of very, very powerful notes. And it's sort of like where the 70s happened after that. We are all outlaws in the eyes of America.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then they switched. A few of the members of Jefferson Airplane moved over to another group they called Jefferson Starship.
Sure.
Jefferson Airplane essentially broke up, and Jefferson Starship basically said, we hate America so much. We all just want to get in a spaceship and start another society in another planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they kind of went off the deep end when it came to.
Well, it brings up things like I don't know if anybody's watched the television show The Expanse, but as soon as we have the technology to be able to go out into space, and as soon as some discovery like the ring is made, where it's, you go through the ring and suddenly you're in another place, and you look out and there's rings all over, and you just choose one of them to go to. So as soon as that happens, well, you're going to have, everything, it's bifurcated, trifurcated, infinity-furcated. Everybody's got their own planet to do with what they want and to be as crazy as they want. But it's going to be very difficult should something like that happen, because who's going to be the yeast in those societies?
Right.
Who's going to drive anything forward?
Right. Thanks, Ben. Before we turn it back to Paul, quick note, there was a question in the chat. Was Tom Lehrer really Jewish? Yes, I mean, I have it right here on Wikipedia. He was born of a secular Jewish family on Manhattan's Upper East Side. His parents were Moses Lehrer, and his mother was Anna Lehrer, who was born Waller, Waller. So yeah, he was Jewish indeed. Okay.
Just one more thing. One story about Tom Lehrer. I heard this. I don't know how true it is, but if the story ain't true, it should be. Okay, as everybody knows, he was a math professor at MIT.
Right.
And he's lecturing one day, and somebody in class asks, what's going to be in the final, basically. And just like all students want to know, how much do we have to actually study? And he said, oh, from now on, nothing we're going to study is going to be on the final. We're just going to talk about this other stuff. And of course, the final happened, and it was all about, from that moment on, not from that moment preceding. And the students are like flabbergasted, say, how could you do this? What, you said none of this was going to be on the final. And he said, I lied.
Yeah.
Yeah. So National Brotherhood Week indeed.
Yeah, he was a brilliant guy. Thanks, Ben. Okay. Kicking it back to Paul for the next. And again, if people have comments, put them in the chat, or there'll be another opportunity for people to share.
Okay. And I believe Tom Lehrer is still with us. He's in his mid-90s at this point. Though has not recorded anything new in quite a long time. It's the 1970s, and I'm going to go in a very different direction, you might say, from social justice, from socially aware themes, from folk music. I always have said that the 1970s really began the very first time that we heard these words. Live from New York, it's Saturday night. And by the way, you notice I was looking up something. The Saturday Night Live, I thought debuted in 1974. I believe it debuted in 1975. So it's in its 47th season. If you want to feel old, consider that. What was on TV on Saturday nights before SNL? No one remembers. Maybe it was a movie, maybe it was wrestling, maybe it was the national anthem being played. And no surprise, I've always thought that was the incredible reaction, if you will, or the not so unexpected reaction to Nixon and Watergate, to the Vietnam War, and to other social trends at that time. SNL was irreverent, sarcastic, caustic, featured rock artists. Just a few years earlier, there was the Jimmy Durante show on Friday nights on ABC. It wasn't a long line chronologically from 69 to 75, but here we were. It's the 70s. Things were getting weird. And I remember in about 1976, I was at my friend John Zucker's house. Some of you know him, on Warwick Avenue in Fairfield. And he put on this record by this new band. And the guitar was like a buzzsaw. The bass you could barely hear. The drums were nuts. The vocalist had this weird British / New York City accent that I couldn't place. It sounded like girl group music on steroids, but what was the most interesting thing to me were the lyrics, and I'll quote some of them to you. I'm a shock trooper in a stupor. Yes, I am. I'm a Nazi Shotzi. You know, I fight for fatherland. What? Here's another song from the same album. They're forming in a straight line. They're going through a tight wind. The kids are losing their minds. The Blitzkrieg Bop. This wasn't She Loves You, Yeah, 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 or Comes the Revolution. I didn't know what it was, and I asked John Zucker, are they serious? And he just shrugged and smiled at me. Well, let me tell you about some of the members who were behind this music. And here's where, again, I'm going to mispronounce stuff. Let's go to the old country. Tamas Edeli was born in January 1949. Again, remember these dates, please, in Budapest, in Hungary. His Jewish parents were professional photographers. They survived the Holocaust by actually being hidden by their neighbors. Many other family members were killed. This family left Hungary in 1956, I think either during or after the Hungarian Revolution. And in 1957, they emigrated to the US and they ended up in South Bronx, I believe, and then they went to Forest Hills. And Tomas, to make things easier, especially for him at school, changed his name to Thomas Edeli. And again, I'm probably mispronouncing it. Well, in high school, Thomas played the guitar in a largely forgotten mid-1960s band called the Tangerine Puppets. You've never heard of them. One of the members was a schoolmate of his, a guitarist named John Cummings. Remember that name, please, who was known as Johnny. After Tommy leaves school, he became an engineer. He was an assistant engineer at the record plant studio in New York City, which was a big deal. He produced a lot of albums, including, most interestingly, the 1970 Jimi Hendrix album, Band of Gypsies. That was near the end of Jimmy's career, but still, that was an achievement. So the guy playing drums on this record is Tamas Edeli. Well, the singer, who had this extremely hard to place, just the strangest voice you've ever heard, because you didn't know if he was supposed to be from New York or Liverpool or both. The singer is Jeffrey Ross Hyman. He was born in 1951 in Queens to a Jewish family. His parents were Charlotte Mandel and Noel Hyman. He was born with I think it's called a parasitic twin growing out of his back, which was incompletely formed and had to be surgically removed. As I said, they lived in, or Don't know if I mentioned it yet. They lived in Forest Hills too. He went to Forest Hills High School. He had a brother, Mickey. Excuse me. And although you could say that Jeffrey was somewhat happy, he was also somewhat of an outcast. He had, as a young man, was diagnosed with a number of issues, including, I believe, obsessive compulsive disorder. And that would affect him all his life. He scared easily. He was afraid of things like the furnace in the family's basement. He was also very tall, well over 6 feet. I think he may have been 6'6". And no surprise, I think I alluded to this. He was, of course, a fan of the Beatles. He was a fan of Phil Spector, remember him from last time, and he was a fan of girl groups. In 1976, I knew nothing of the Jewish heritage of Tommy Ramone, Joey Ramone, Johnny Ramone, who was John Cummings, the guitarist, if you want to charitably call him that. I didn't know anything about their Jewish background. I had no idea what they were up to. In fact, if you look at the album cover of their first album, Ramones from 1976, they look like they could have been 4 Puerto Rico guys from the Bronx, especially because of their bowl haircuts. What I didn't pick up on, and here I'm going to reference Saturday Night Live and Mel Brooks, and think about the producers. What I didn't pick up on was the age-old concept of Jewish humor, or should I say a big part of Jewish humor, that one way to survive something or to endure a bad situation is to make fun of it. Many of their songs were funny. Jeffrey himself made, shall we say, fun of his own fears. It shouldn't surprise you that a kind of an interesting Ramones song is called I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement, remembering his fears as a kid of what was in the family basement. There were a lot of songs that started with I don't wanna, and there were a few I do's. But the point is this, I didn't get it at first, and maybe I was too young to get it, but now I do. It was a sarcastic response to the 70s, or to the events that preceded things in the mid 70s. I had no idea what was going on though. And I think a lot of people missed the joke, missed the humor, didn't understand what was going on. It was very easy to not be in on the joke. I'm trying to think of the right words and choose the right words. And a couple of other items, and again, we can fall down the rabbit hole. One of their albums was produced by Phil Spector, who was crazy back then. I think it was 1980. I think the album was End of the Century. I think we mentioned last time that he did suffer from significant issues, even probably starting in at least the mid 60s. And by 1980, I think they were in full flower. What else? The Ramones were on the major record label Sire Records, which was formed in 1966 by, surprise, Jews Seymour Stein, and I can't pronounce his last name, I think Richard Gotter. Richard, by the way, was the guy who earlier wrote My Boyfriend's Back and Hang On Sloopy, among other hits. So these were the two guys who formed Sire Records. If you're really a music fan, you'll know that Sire was a label for many progressive, pop, punk, and new wave acts, including somebody named Madonna, who's been known to engage in the Kabbalah from time to time, even though she's not Jewish. I think she's a wannabe. I don't know if she ever converted. Here's another funny fact about the Ramones. They played many concerts at a club on the Bowery called CBGB's, which oddly stood for Country Blues, Bluegrass and Blues, Country Bluegrass and Blues. You had a punk band playing there. The club was owned by a guy named Hillel, or to his friends, Hilly Crystal. Hillel, let's call him that, was born in 1931. He was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And here's a fun fact. Hillel's father was Shammai Crystal. And Shammai, I believe, is a Russian pogrom, if I pronounce that correctly, survivor, from the 1870s. The dad, Shammai, was named after the Jewish scholar Shammai, looking at my notes. And Hillel was named after Shammai's contemporary, Hillel the Elder. But even though I was never there, I was told that if you visited CBGB's, you would have no idea about Hillel's background. That's an example. And again, this guy is Hillel, named after Hillel the elder. You would have no idea of the Jewish background of this guy who owned this club, and yet those are the facts. Hillel, the name Hillel didn't just come out of the earth. There were reasons for this. But again, it goes to the point that the rabbi and I have made, that the Jewish influence is just about everywhere you look. Now, a point we're making is you may have to do a lot of digging or some digging to get to that point, but when you look, there it is. So that's the Ramones. I do have one more long story that I'll get to about some more New York Jews that kind of went in a slightly different direction, a more glam direction, as they might say. But that's the story of the Ramones. Thank you.
Paul, I never told you this, but and no one here knows this, but Judy and my first date, my wife Judy, was at CBGB's. No, Ben, I am not going to talk about the Fugs, okay? We're not going to talk about Thule Kupferberg, all right? And Ed Sanders and those crazy guys. All right, but anyway, Judy and I met at the Jewish, this is kind of funny. We met at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and we were at this kind of social gathering, meet and greet, get to know one another kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I said to Judy at some point, I said, let's get out of here. And we hopped on the subway and we went down to CBGB's, the punk club, the punk rock club down in Lower Manhattan.
Right.
Wow. And yeah, that was our first date. Yeah. So
well, it should not surprise you, Rabbi. Again, I just had to look this up so I can read the lyrics. The Ramones had a song called "Judy is a Punk." Now, does it surprise you
not this
that
one.
the lyrics start like this? Jackie is a punk, Judy is a run. They both went down to Berlin. There you go again, and joined the Ice Capades. Again, the satire, or even beyond satire, it is no coincidence to me that the Ramones and Saturday Night Live kind of arose at the same time. So again, I had to look that up, but Judy is a Punk, a Ramones song. Who knows? Maybe they wrote it about her.
Yeah, I noticed in the chat, Ben had asked about Al Cooper. Again, that's not so much on our subject, Al Cooper, because we're focusing more on the 70s and 80s at this point. But yeah, I believe Al Cooper was Jewish. Al Cooper, his name was spelled with a K, and he was a part of the band Blood, Sweat, and Tears on their first album. Then he left.
Yeah, to be clear, he started Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Yeah, he was in the beginning of Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
It was his band for the first
And then he
album.
became famous for the Super Session album, where he played with Stephen Stills and Mike Bloomfield, another Jew, Mike Bloomfield. Yeah, there's so much. Like, again, Paul talks about going down the rabbit hole. There is no end to this, but I want to bring in a real quick theme, because I'm trying to tie in some of the historical themes as well. So what were the two events or trends in the history of world history that affected Jews in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s? Well, the first was the 6-Day War.
Right.
Because the 6-Day War had such a huge effect on especially young Jews. I mean, of course, the older generations, of course, were deeply affected in the sense of celebrating Israel's great victory, and it was considered a miracle in our times, right? But for young Jews, it was something that is almost impossible to describe in terms of how many young Jews were affected by it, were, because of Israel's victory, became fiercely proud of their Jewishness and decided to go and visit Israel for the first time, whether it be on youth group kinds of trips or other kinds of tours. The 6-Day War, again, you can't talk about the 6-Day War without talking about the other side of that, coin, which was the 73 Yom Kippur War. The jubilation and joy of the 6-Day War was deeply, deeply compromised and mitigated by the tragedy of the 73 Yom Kippur War. Even though Israel won the war, pretty much every family lost someone in their extended family in that war. It was a horrible social cataclysm for Israel, and it was extremely depressing. But Jews the world over were deeply, deeply affected, and in America too, by Israel's victories. And then one other social trend that was deeply affecting Jews worldwide was the plight of Soviet Jewry.
Yes.
The plight of the refuseniks, especially in the 70s and 80s. I was one of the rabbis who in the 80s went to visit refuseniks secretly, in the former Soviet Union. So on the one hand, we had Jews rallying behind Israel, the great Jewish homeland Zionist state. And on the other hand, we had Jews rallying behind our Soviet Jewish brethren who were being persecuted as a result of official state anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Russia. Now, the reason I mention these things, and I'm going to wrap it up quick here, the reason I mention these things is unless somebody else in this group tonight can correct me, or unless you see it differently than I do, because I may be missing something. But it appears to me that just as American Jews made it and came out from the margins into the center, which is where we pretty much are now. I'm not saying anti-Semitism doesn't exist. We all know that anti-Semitism is a very severe problem, but institutional anti-Semitism is really, in most cases, a thing of the past. Again, there are exceptions to this, I admit, but Jews have made it in America. We are no longer marginalized. This is explained in a lot of ways in terms of our roles in leadership roles in business, politics, government, academia, the arts, culture, and also very high rates of assimilation and of intermarriage as well, have all kind of contributed to the fact that Jews have become mainstream in America, and we have made it. And I think to some degree that is reflected in the Jews in rock and roll kind of trends of the 70s and 80s, because you might have expected that the Jews would reflect some of these some of the trends about Zionism in Israel, the 6-Day War, and some of the concerns and activity about Soviet Jewry. We were so much into civil rights and anti-Vietnam protests in the 50s and 60s. But in terms of mainstream Jews in rock and roll or rock or progressive rock or different forms of rock, you don't really see much, if any. You don't see much unless it's really under the surface when it comes to pro-Israel, pro-Soviet Jewry, activism kinds of stuff. So here's the point I want to drive through, and then I'll turn it over. Just as we made it as American Jews and became mainstream, the kind of Jewish themes that had been so prevalent in some ways in rock and roll and so on started to dissipate, and the role of Jews as Jews in modern contemporary rock music became less and less important, I would say. The fact that there were Jews who were parts of famous groups, very well-known, successful groups, it became almost accidental and incidental that they just happened to be Jewish. Paul, can we take, or Carol, with your permission, can we take a minute for any other comments or questions before we wrap it up? The last segment will be Paul. I've pretty much said my piece. Debbie.
I just want to say before we end, because of Facebook, Paul, before we end, do not leave out the few questions that you put on Facebook, especially your wife. I'm curious to hear. So I hope you're going to include that in there because it intrigued me what you put on Facebook. So that's all.
Special bonus round. Yeah, we already talked about the basement, and but next up is Toady Fields. So, and then I'll tell the story about my wife's contribution to the music world. But,
So, just because, you know, somebody's got to start questions, I'll do it. So Rabbi, you were saying that nobody's overtly Jewish who is doing all this stuff now. Isn't that actually the definition of having made it?
Yes.
You know, you don't have to proclaim who you are. This is who I am. If you want to find out that I'm Jewish, it's fine. You don't have to, but it doesn't make me any less Jewish.
Yeah.
I had a question about, you know, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. You know, none of us would, you know, cop to them, but okay, they chose that business. They rose to the top of that business.
Yeah,
You know,
it's an excellent point, Ben. We didn't have anything to prove anymore, you know? We already proved ourselves. Thank you. Okay, Carol's such a good program chair. She's sending me chat reminders. It's almost 8:30 and Paul still has stuff to talk about. All right. Is there one more quick comment question before we go right back to Paul? Okay, not hearing any, right? Okay, Paul, back to you.
okay. Well, here to me is the, you know, I'll tell you the story of what I consider to be the ultimate success story in rock. And, but I'll start by talking about Toady Fields. I don't know about you. My grandma loved the Mike Douglas show in the afternoons. I think it originated from Philadelphia. It was on around 4:30. So my grandma liked Mike Douglas. I think everyone's grandmother liked Mike Douglas. And in 1974, Toady Fields was on the show along with this really weird looking rock star who had makeup, and he had an outfit that looked like a cape with wings. And the long story short is, at one point, apropos of nothing, Toady Fields points at this guy and says, "You can't hide the beak. I bet you're a nice Jewish boy under that costume and makeup." And the rock star said, "You have no idea, Toady." Well, who was this guy? And what did Toady Fields know that the rest of the world, including me, didn't know at the time? Well, Toady was talking to Chaim Witz. You all know who Chaim Witz is, right? Let me tell you about him. He was born in 1949, interesting date again, at Rambam, I think that's Maimonides, Rambam Hospital in Haifa, Israel. He was the son of Jewish immigrants from Hungary. His mother was Flora Kovacs, who became Florence Klein in America, came from Hungary. She was in prison and concentration camps. In fact, just about everybody in Florence's family passed away. Chaim's father was named Ferenc Witz. He was a carpenter, and Chaim spent his early life in Tirat Carmel. I think it's pronounced correctly, in Israel. Well, his parents got divorced, and at age 8, not knowing any English, important fact there, the family, meaning mom and the kids, came to New York. In New York, Chaim changed his name to Gene, so he became Gene Klein, taking his mother's name. He actually briefly attended a religious school, Yeshiva Torah Vodas, I believe in Brooklyn, before transferring to a public school. Gene was interested in education. He attended Richmond College and Sullivan County Community College, both in New York. He knew the importance of words. He actually became an excellent typist. And because of that skill, he got a job at Vogue magazine as an assistant to an editor. He learned a lot, he said, about fashion, image, and design. And he was interested in education, as I mentioned. He even worked for Chaim, or Gene, as a sixth grade instructor on the Upper West Side. I forget if it was English as a second language or not. That I don't know, but he was a sixth grade teacher. Now, not surprisingly, and almost in a small way like me, he was really influenced by the culture of 1960s New York. He said he learned English by watching a lot of TV, including Channel 11, WPIX. He read lots of Marvel comics. I did too. And his favorite character was the Inhuman Black Bolt, who was kind of famous for being a character with caped wings. And of course, no surprise, Chaim was very much inspired by the Beatles. They blew him away. Across town in New York City, there was Stanley Bertram Eisen. He was born in 1952. Yes, his parents were Jewish. His mother came from a family that fled Nazi Germany, moved to Holland, the Netherlands, and then to New York City. The dad's parents were from Poland. He was Jewish, but he has said in interviews his family wasn't that observant, and in fact, he studied for it, but did not celebrate bar mitzvah. Interestingly, Stanley's right ear was kind of misshapen because of a birth defect called, I think, microtia, until he had it rebuilt in 1982. But however, something that was never fixed, Stanley is deaf on his right side. He finds it difficult to figure out where a sound is coming from, and he actually has trouble understanding speech in a noisy environment to this day, and he just turned 70. And of course, as you can imagine, he was at PS 98, he was picked on by the kids because of his ear. But despite his problems, he enjoyed listening to music. He loved Dick Clark's American Bandstand. We haven't mentioned that yet. He learned to sing harmony with his family. He learned to play guitar when he was a little kid. And of course, just like his friend Chaim, when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan in 1964, he was wowed. And he said to himself, I don't care about my ear. I can do what they're doing. It's not out of my reach. Now, some of you probably know I am talking about Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley of KISS. Very popular in the 1970s, and Gene and Paul are still part of the band to this day. They formed right around the time the Ramones did in 1974, right around the time of Saturday Night Live. Folks, this is not a coincidence. I know in the 1970s, a lot of people thought that KISS stood for wacky stuff like Knights in Satan's Service, but how wrong they were. Like Gene Simmons told Toady Fields in 1974, you have no idea. And to this day, Gene Simmons has been very complimentary of and a strong supporter of Israel. He's been back, he's met family members and such. Now, you wouldn't know the Jewish themes listening to KISS, but the influence is there. They moved from Israel to the United States because, in Gene's words, they thought they could really make it big here if only they could move. And so they did. But again, as a kid in the 1970s, the Ramones or whoever, you don't look at the album cover and see these guys running around in costumes, singing about this and that and think, oh, they're Jewish, but they are. And the influences, they're there. But again, as I've used the metaphor before, you have to dust and scrape a bit, but they are there. So that's the story of KISS. And once you hear this, as I said last week, and know about this, you will look at things and hear things, I think, in a slightly different manner. So that's my 2 cents about Chaim Witz.
And what about Marcia?
Okay, there is a true story that she's told me. And I think on the Facebook page, one of her friends said, "Oh, I know what you're talking about." Marcia is a proud graduate of NYU, as long as I think a couple of other listeners on the call tonight, and she lived in a dorm, Weinstein Hall. And for a while, she helped type up and prepare papers for a fellow student who was really into music. And I'm probably going to tell the story wrong, but he wasn't the most pleasant person at all. And basically, so she helped this guy set up papers, and this person who she helped eventually became a very, very, very famous record producer who was really responsible for mainstreaming rap in the United States. We're talking about bands like the Beastie Boys, who I think most of them are not, if not all, were Jewish. Produced many, many, many other artists in the course of his career, which is still ongoing. I did not write out a list, but I'm just throwing out Johnny Cash and Neil Diamond. And basically, I think that Marcia would agree that if not for her help, he might not have really gotten through school. This man eventually became a co-president of Columbia Records. His name is Rick Rubin, a nice Jewish guy from Long Island. And Marcia just texted me that he was a very nice guy. So that is our connection, that Marcia, you might say, helped with Rick Rubin's education. Rick became a very popular record label owner, record producer. And Rick was running his record and music business from his dorm room in Weinstein down the hall, if you will, from where Marcia lived. So that's my very fast telling of the story.
That's a cool story, and bringing it all the way back to the beginning, and then I'm going to bring it back to Carol. Rick Rubin, as you know, Paul, did an extensive 6-part interview with Paul McCartney called McCartney 1, 2, 3 on Hulu. I think you can watch it on Hulu or one of those.
Yeah, it's on the Hulu channel. And
Rick Rubin, even with all the exposure he's had to music and geniuses and talent, incredible talents throughout his career, and his own talent, of course, is extraordinary.
Yes.
But he is, in those interviews, continually blown away by Paul McCartney. He just can't get it. It's like he's like a bull in a china shop. He's like a kid in a candy store. He is
starstruck, right?
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Paul McCartney. So taking it back to the very beginning of last year, what's Jewish about the Beatles? Okay, Carol, back to you.
Okay, Rabbi. So I first of all, there's so much information. If I could absorb it all and know as much as you, I would be a genius, both of you, Paul and Rabbi. But I would like to say that in education, if you can share something and it goes on from what you've taught so that somebody else learns and picks it up, you can consider yourselves a success. And I had a conversation, I'll tell you with whom in 10 seconds or less, and we found ourselves talking about part 1 of how much we had learned and didn't know. And that person was the person you started off with, wishing a happy birthday to Edith Winnick. So we learned a lot without realizing what we learned. And that was a whole conversation we were having. So you both should take tremendous pride in what you've shared and what you've taught, because sitting here, I'm not sure I could tell you, but with another person, the dialogue was amazing. So on behalf of Rodeph Sholom, I can't thank you enough. Your knowledge, your sharing, your interpretation. Rabbi, you're taking us away from what's going on in the world at the moment is really so important. And in order to tie this together with a little fun, before you all run away, we will do the raffle, but I want to remind everybody that on April 30th, we are having a very special program at Rodeph Sholom where we are welcoming Rabbi Stephen Leon from Southwest Texas, where he will be talking about his work with crypto Jews. He will be the Esther Kelman Memorial Lecture speaker, and he will be joined at services that morning with not only our own Rabbi Eisenberg and Cantor Nima Hirsch, but with Rabbi David Nelson as well. So mark your calendars for those of you who are not local and plan on joining us. For those who are local, you know you'll be hearing about this from me until April 29th. So Debbie, without further ado, who is pulling the raffle tonight?
I'm going to get Lanny to pull the raffle. I don't know if anybody, I shouldn't give what, if you're taping the UConn game, my husband just came in and made some face. So I won't tell in case you're taping it, but he said something crazy happened. All right, hold on. Lanny.
I guess that means she's interrupting the game for him to pull the winning raffle ticket.
Yeah, he's coming to pull the willing because I don't want anybody to ever think that I land.
Put it in a pot?
We're staying in a hotel, we're in Florida. So I had to go underneath the little kitchenette and find something to put this in. So hold on, I don't think he heard me, hold it. Oh, you're coming?
We need a drum roll.
Lanny.
Okay, drum roll, here he is. So close your eyes.
Oh, thank you, Lanny.
Taking me away from the UConn game.
I just don't tell that anybody in case they're taping it. Go ahead.
Do you want me to announce who it is?
Okay.
Yes.
Looks like Brian Bedford.
Brian Bedford.
Hey, Brian.
Very nice. Congratulations, Brian.
Hey, Carol.
Yes, Rabbi.
Lanny ran away too soon to go back to the UConn game. I wanted him to help me. I can't think of a better way to end than to sing happy birthday to Edith.
100%.
In Hebrew, in English, and then in Hebrew.
Absolutely. I think
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Edith. Happy birthday to you. Yom Huledet Sameach. Yom Huledet Sameach. Yom Huledet Sameach. Yom Huledet Sameach. Edith, skip around the room, skip around the room.
Thank you.
Many more, Edith.
It means a lot to me to be able to spend a few minutes with you all on my birthday. It ends a very good day for me today to be with you.
Good.
good, because you always make our day. Okay, so I thank you all for coming. Keep
Thank
your
you.
eyes and ears open. We have lots of programs coming and there'll be plenty more. So
Thank you.
thank you, Paul. Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Paul.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Rabbi
Thank
Paul
you.
Carol, read what's in the chat. Somebody suggested something which we could focus on next year. Just
David
Wait.
Herman.
American Pop, an animated film that touched upon some of the themes
Ah.
the Rabbi said.
It's
Okay.
available
Thank
on
you.
Amazon Prime for $3.
American
David.
Pop. I will write it down.
Program
because
idea, Carol.
I'm writing it down. I
Thank
got
you.
it.
thank you,
Perfect.
Paul. Thank you, Rabbi.
Great.
Amazing. And we
Thank
hope
you.
we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Very
interesting.
Great-
Thank you
great
very
job.
much.
Always
Thank you.
looking for new ideas, more ideas. So thank you. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay,
Great job, Paul.
stay safe,
Yeah.
everybody.
You
As Ringo
too.
would say, peace and love, peace and love.
Yes, love you.
Amen.
Okay,
Good night.
Take care.
good night.
Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Carol. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a